Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending. This will be a meeting of the International Communist Party, Cutting the Net, a Marxist analysis of China. You can find additional information at international-communist-party.org, as well as our publishing website, clpublishers.com, for printed material and further information. We'll now begin the meeting. I fall asleep just standing like that. The paper before my eyes fades yellow. With a steel pen, I chisel on it uneven black, full of working words: workshop, assembly line, machine, work card, overtime, wages. They've trained me to become docile. Don't know how to shout or rebel, how to complain or denounce, only how to silently suffer exhaustion. When I first set foot in this place, I hoped only for that gray payslip on the 10th of each month to grant me some belated solace. For this, I had to grind away my corners, grind away my words, refuse to skip work, refuse sick leave, refuse leave for private reasons, refuse to be late, refuse to leave early. By the assembly line, I stood straight like iron, hands like butterflies. How many days, how many nights did I, just like that, standing up, fall asleep? Zhu Liji, August 2011. These verses reveal the lived reality of the Chinese working class, not the statistics, not the aggregate data about growth and poverty reduction, not the gleaming photographs of Shanghai and Shenzhen, but the actual lived reality of millions of workers, workers who labor, built those railways, those cities, those safety nets so enthusiastically celebrated by those who have never had to live under them. This morning, we take up the question, what is China? Not what China calls itself, not what flag flies over its state apparatus, but what China really is in its class character, in its historical trajectory, and in its role in the world economy. We will answer this question in four parts. First, the history. From the collapse of the imperial order through the betrayal of the Shanghai workers in 1927 through 1949, the Great Leap Forward, the Sino-Soviet split, the Cultural Revolution, and the Dengist turn that produced the China we face today. Second, the Belt and Road Initiative, what presents itself as China's great gift to the oppressed nations of the world. We will ask whether anti-imperialism is actually what we are looking at or whether we are watching one imperialism displacing another. Third, the Chinese dream, Xi Jinping's program for national rejuvenation by 2049, what it actually delivers to the 900 million workers who fund it, and what the repression of labor organizers, feminist groups, and legal advocates tell us about the class character of the state pursuing it. And fourth, the only question that ultimately matters, what is the task of the communist movement in this period? At every stage, the same test applies. Not whether China built railways, not whether living standards have risen in nominal terms, not whether the flag is red, but who bears its cost, who holds the power, and who gets crushed the moment they try to organize against it. The session will proceed accordingly. Let us begin with the chronology of the Chinese nation, from its revolutionary origins to its emergence as a modern imperialist power. Because to understand what China is today, we have to understand how it got there. It is not a story of socialist construction or national liberation. It is the story of capitalism establishing itself in one of the last great territories on earth, violently, rapidly, and on the backs of the most exploited working class in human history. At the beginning of the 20th century, China was in a state of profound crisis. A century of imperialist plunder had hollowed out the old imperial order. The bourgeoisie was too weak to complete its own revolution, too dependent on foreign capital, too unable to challenge the landlords, too incapable of unifying the nation. Sun Yat-sen tried in 1911 and failed. What followed was the warlord period. China carved up into spheres of influence, each controlled by a different foreign power backing a different general. Imperialism in its rawest form. It was in this context the Chinese Communist Party was born in 1921, and with it, the possibility of a genuine proletarian revolution. The industrial working class, concentrated in the coastal cities, was beginning to organize. Shanghai, Canton, the great port cities, these were the places where a real workers' movement was emerging. And the question that hung over everything was the same question that had hung over Russia in 1905 and 1917. Would the proletariat lead the democratic revolution and transform it into its own dictatorship, or would it subordinate itself to the bourgeoisie and wait? Stalin answered that question for China. He forced the CCP into a merger with Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang. He told Chinese workers to trust the national bourgeoisie. He imposed the theory of stages. First, complete the bourgeois revolution, then, maybe later, eventually, think about socialism. And in April 1927, Chiang Kai-shek revealed what the alliance actually meant. He massacred the Shanghai workers and destroyed the entire communist vanguard. The Chinese working class would pay the price. By early 1927, the workers of Shanghai had bravely risen up in armed insurrection, organized and disciplined, and took the city themselves before the nationalist army arrived. They established workers' councils, much like revolutionary Russia, and were governing Shanghai. The Shanghai Commune was an accomplished fact, a victory of the proletariat of China and of the world, and the Chinese working class had proven it was capable of taking power. That is precisely why it had to be destroyed. By April 1927, Chiang Kai-shek arrived and showed what the United Fronts always meant: subordination to the bourgeois national cause. With the backing of foreign imperialist powers and the explicit support of Stalin, the nationalists moved against the workers. Thousands were arrested, executed, and disappeared. Uprisings across the southern provinces were crushed. 300,000 dead. The Shanghai Commune was drowned in the blood of the Chinese proletariat vanguard, and it was defeated and utterly annihilated. That moment was decisive. The definitive separation between the working class and the CCP dates back to April 1927. After that massacre, there was no proletarian party left in China. This, we must be absolutely clear, is not a mistake of the United Front policy. It was its logic in its clearest form. Stalin had been warned by the General Secretary of the CCP, Shen Duzhu, himself that this alliance would produce exactly this result. He proceeded anyways. For Stalinism, the diplomatic survival of the Soviet state ranked above the survival of the Chinese proletariat. The massacre was the price of the alliance, and Stalin paid for it with the lives of revolutionaries. Only a peasant army remained. What emerged from that defeat was Maoism. Mao readopted the principles of Sun Yat-sen and converted the CCP into the real Kuomintang. That is, a genuine bourgeois nationalist party, but one with the support of poor peasantry instead of the faint-hearted bourgeoisie. Mao was Stalin's direct descendant. His objective was singular and bourgeois: the democratic national revolution. The double revolution, where the proletariat leads the democratic struggle and immediately transforms it into the proletarian dictatorship, was dead. Stalinism had killed it. And what replaced it was a peasant army marching under red flags towards bourgeois destination. And Stalinism confirmed this a second time when Japan invaded. The CCP rejoined the Kuomintang, suspending land reform, shelving class struggle, and subordinating everything to national defense. In Europe, they called it the Popular Front. In China, they called it national resistance. But the political content was the same. The working class had been disarmed and its revolution postponed indefinitely in the name of the nation. The CCP had not simply allied with the class enemy, it had merged with it. The victory of 1949 must be understood in this light. When Mao proclaimed the People's Republic, this was historically significant. China shook off a century of imperialist plunder. It unified the nation. It expelled foreign companies. These were genuine bourgeois democratic achievements. And we say so clearly, because it is precisely by recognizing what 1949 was that we can be precise about what it was not. It was not socialist. It was not a dictatorship of the proletariat. It was the triumph of bourgeois national democracy. It is the early 1950s, and the People's Republic must now govern what it has won. The CCP entered the cities and immediately enforced respect for private property. It left capitalists managing their own enterprises and collecting dividends. It distributed land to 300 million peasants and created 300 million small proprietors whose plots could not generate the surplus needed to fuel industrial development. The cooperative system of the early 1950s failed to solve this. Meanwhile, Russia withdrew its technicians, severing China's main source of industrial expertise. Industry needed agricultural surplus to expand. Agriculture needed industrial machinery to modernize, and neither could advance without the other. At the same time, a major strike wave was building in the coastal cities with workers making wage demands and threatening to organize outside party control. The state faced structural crisis from above and class pressure from below. The Great Leap Forward followed directly from this crisis. The state collectivized agriculture, broke up small plots, and concentrated rural labor under central control, all in order to extract the grain surplus that industrial development required. It was a state under enormous economic pressure reaching for the most drastic instruments available. What the collectivization accomplished was China's violent transition from a peasant economy to an industrial capitalist one. This was not unique to China. It was the universal history of capitalist development. The English enclosures, the destruction of artisan production, the forced creation of the landless proletariat. Every capitalist country went through its own version of this process. But China did it in a decade, under state direction and with a red flag happening to be flying over it. Steel production went from 158,000 tons in 1949 to over 100 million by 1996, the largest and fastest industrialization in human history. And the historically significant product of that process, from our standpoint, is not the industrialization itself, but what it created. The most numerous industrial proletariat on earth, because it is that class, not the CCP and not the red flag, that carries within it the genuine potential for a communist revolution. When Deng Xiaoping's reform line triumphed, the gates were opened, foreign capital flooded in, the communes were dissolved, the coastal cities that had been the heart of the workers' movement a century before became the assembly floor of the world economy. The workers' movement a century before, the skyscrapers went up, the factories multiplied, the export machine was built, and China's bourgeoisie, forged through decades of state-directed development, emerged as one of the most powerful ruling classes on earth, with global ambitions to match. What stands before us today is not the heir to any communist tradition. It is a rising imperialist power, confident, expansionist, and hungry, fighting not against the world capitalist order, but for a dominant place within it, which brings us to today. China in its imperialist era. We are told that the Belt and Road Initiative is anti-imperialism in action. China is building railways in Africa, ports in Pakistan, infrastructure across Southeast Asia. China is offering the developing world an alternative to the IMF austerity that the World Bank offers. This is the argument. And on the surface, it sounds compelling. It sounds like solidarity. It sounds like a rising power genuinely committed to lifting up the oppressed nations of the world. But let us look at what it actually is. China extends loans to developing countries at interest, with conditions, with Chinese labor and Chinese material doing the construction. The infrastructure gets built, the debt accumulates, and when the country cannot pay, and many cannot, because the loans are structured and difficult to repay, China moves in to collect. The port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka is the prime example everyone knows. Sri Lanka could not service its debt, so China took a 99-year lease on the port, a military and commercial foothold in the Indian Ocean, acquired not through the conquest, but through compound interest. Lenin described this mechanism over a century ago. Finance capital does not need gunboats. It extends credit, and when the debtor cannot pay, it collects the territory, resources, and strategic assets instead. That is not any sort of new model. That is just imperialism. The pattern repeats. Zambia's national electricity grid was put up as a collateral for Chinese loans. African nations signing infrastructure contracts with clauses exempting Chinese companies from local labor laws, meaning Chinese workers are imported to build the infrastructure while local workers are excluded. Belt and Road is not charity and it never was meant to be. It is China securing raw materials, markets, and strategic positioning for its own expanding capitalism. The debt dependency is not a side effect, it's the entire purpose. Subordinated debtor nations become dependent on Chinese capital the same way 19th century colonies became dependent on British capital. Different century and a different flag, but with the same exact function, imperialism. So when people celebrate Belt and Road as China challenging Western hegemony, what they are actually celebrating is one imperialist displacing another. The workers of Zambia and Sri Lanka gain nothing from having their national assets held by collateral by Beijing instead of Washington. As for Africa, Chinese investment will do what capitalist investment has always done everywhere it has gone. It will pull peasants off the land, drive them into factories, and create a new industrial working class under brutal conditions. We are already seeing it in Ethiopia, where Chinese owned factories are producing a wage labor force where none existed before. This is not nothing. It is the same process of primitive accumulation we have described in China, playing out again on African soil. But let us be precise about what it is. It's not any form of solidarity. It's capital expanding to where labor is cheapest, extracting maximum surplus from workers with no independent organizations and no political rights. The African worker emerging from that process will face the same enemy that the Chinese worker does. The flag flying over the factory changes, but it is still exploitation. The only winners are the Chinese state and the comprador bourgeoisies of the recipient countries who facilitate these arrangements in exchange for their own cut. Belt and Road is China doing to the developing world exactly what the West did to China during the century of humiliation. And that is the ugliest truth beneath the anti-imperialist rhetoric.
Next section is Chinese dream for who? So we have traced the history. We have exposed the Belt and Road. Now let us talk about the Chinese dream. Xi Jinping his grand vision for China's national rejuvenation. It is presented as something new, something different, a confident alternative to the hollow promises of Western capitalism. It is not. The Chinese dream is not an alternative to imperialism. It is imperialism's newest and most ambitious expression. And for the Chinese working class, the people whose labor makes it possible is not a dream at all. The American dream told workers that prosperity was available to anyone willing to work hard enough. And in doing so, it dressed up the ambitions of a rising imperialist power in the language of individual aspiration. The Chinese dream serves exactly the same function. Different nation, different century, same ideological mechanism. The ruling class's program for global dominance presented as the collective aspiration of an entire people. To understand this, you have to understand what Xi himself says it is. Xi frames it explicitly in three movements. Mao made China stand up, ending the century of humiliation, expelling the foreign powers, and unifying the nation. Deng made China rich, opening to foreign capital, building the export machine, creating the industrial powerhouse. Now Jing is making China strong, and Jing is explicit about what strong means. By 2049, the centurion of the People's Republic, China must be the leading world power in military strength, technological capacity, and global influence. Taiwan must be reunified. The South China Sea must be controlled. The Belt and Road must lock in resource corridors and strategic footholds across this global South. The fuel that powers every single aspect of this program is the surplus extracted from the Chinese working class. Now let us look at what the Chinese dream actually delivers to those workers. Premier Li Keqiang, the CCP's own premier, confirmed that 600 million Chinese people live on a monthly income of roughly $140. 600 million people, nearly half the population of the most celebrated development success story in human history. A migrant worker hoping to buy a small apartment in a tier two city would need to save 100% of their income for 80 years. The bottom 50% of China's population commands just 14% of the national income. This is the Chinese dream in numbers. The healthcare system celebrated as a safety net. A single hospital stay costs $700, 5 months of disposable income for a worker earning $5 a day. The result is a culture of medical avoidance where workers delay treatment until it's too late because they cannot afford the entry fee to the system. The Haku system, China's internal passport regime, means that 300 million migrant workers who physically built the modern cities are locked out of urban schools and subsidized healthcare in those same cities. They build the infrastructure, they are excluded from using it. Does Xi Jinping know this? Of course he does. When Xi came to power in 2012, strike activity had been rising for years. Workers at Walmart China had staged coordinated walkouts. Honda assembly workers had shut down production lines demanding union elections. Labor NGOs, independent organizations providing legal service, strike support, and organizing capacity to workers outside the state-controlled unions were profiteering in Guangdong. Feminist collectives were connecting factory conditions, sexual harassment, and reproductive rights into a broader challenge to the social order. Xi's response was immediate and consequential. First, feminist organizers, the Feminist Five, arrested in 2015 for planning a subway campaign against sexual harassment. Then labor NGOs, mass raids on Guangdong's organizations in 2015, dozens arrested. Then human rights lawyers, over 300 detained in the 709 crackdown. That sequence is not accidental, but it targets precisely those building working class organizational capacity outside party control. The CCP studied how wage concessions and union rights in the West eventually produced organic crisis for capital and chose permanent authoritarian suppression as the deliberate alternative. Calculated class warfare from above. The youth crisis is where the contradictions are most visible. China's urban youth unemployment reached 21.3% in mid 2023. And when it hit that record, the National Bureau of Statistics simply dropped or stopped publishing the data. They hit it. Competition for jobs, housing, and education had become so brutal that millions of young Chinese have simply opted out. The lying flat movement where young people collectively refuse the demand for total sacrifice in a system that offers them nothing in return. And Xi's response? In 2025, the Chinese government launched a censorship campaign against bloggers and influencers who argued that hard work is pointless. The state is now censoring pessimism because when workers stop believing in the dream stops working as a tool of control. The Foxconn revolt in 2022 is the sharpest expression of what is building beneath the surface. When zero COVID lockdowns trapped workers inside factory compounds, they didn't just revolt against the health policy, they revolted against unpaid wages, broken contracts, and the realization that the state would sacrifice them completely for what it called stability. Workers fought security guards in the streets of the factory compound. They tore down barriers with their bare hands. And the state that calls itself communist, that marches under a red flag, that claims to represent the working class, sent in riot police to crush them. That is the Chinese dream meeting the Chinese reality. And it will happen again because the conditions that produced that revolt, stagnating wages, crushing hours, no independent organization, no legal protection, total state control of labor relations. Those conditions are not improving. They are worsening as growth slows and the state needs to squeeze more surplus from workers to fund its imperial ambitions. It is not a dream for workers. It is a dream for the Chinese ruling class, for the state capitalists, the party elite, the new bourgeois that has accumulated 68% of the nation's wealth, while the bottom half survives on 14% of national income. Xi Jinping thought is not Marxism. It is the ideology of a rising imperialist bourgeois dressing its class interests in the language of national rejuvenation. And the workers building that empire in the factories, on the construction sites, in the dormitories, they are not its beneficiaries. They are its raw material. The communist dream. But we return to where we began, to the poem, to the voice of Zhu Liji, a Foxconn worker who wrote about standing at an assembly line until he fell asleep on his feet, who wrote about being trained into docility, ground down into silence, reduced to a gray pay slip on the 10th of each month. He wrote that poem in August 2011. In September 2014, at 24 years old, he threw himself from a building at the Foxconn plant. That is the Chinese dream's final answer to the Chinese working class. No railways, not railroads, not poverty statistics, not Xi Jinping's thought. A 24-year-old poet throwing himself off of a building because the weight of capital had become unbearable. And we say his death and the deaths of thousands like him do not call for mourning alone. They call for organization. They call for revolution. They call for the only force in human history that has ever actually threatened to end what killed him. Because here is what the party's analysis ultimately concludes and is not pessimistic. It is precise. The Chinese working class will rise again. The conditions are already producing the revolt. Foxconn, the lying flat movement, youth unemployment is so catastrophic that the state stopped publishing the data. Labor groups crushed precisely because they were working. Feminist organizers repressed precisely because they were connecting. The CCP is not suppressing a passive population. It is suppressing a class that is beginning to move, and it knows it. Every repression is an emission of fear. Every censored blogger, every arrested labor organizer, every riot police deployment at a factory gate is the ruling class acknowledging that beneath the surface of the Chinese dream, the working class is stirring. The question is not whether Chinese workers will fight back. History has already answered that question. The question is whether there will be a revolutionary party to give the struggle the direction it needs when the moment comes. And that is where we enter, not with arrogance, not with pretension that we will have all the answers or that our small party will single-handedly ignite the world revolution, but with something more important than arrogance, with theoretical clarity, with historical continuity, and with what our comrades have described as faith in revolution, not as a Catholic believes in Christ, but as a mathematician believes in his equation. We do not hope for revolution the way the religious hope for salvation. We understand revolution the way a scientist understands the law of nature. The falling rate of profit is not an opinion. The inevitable crisis of capitalism is not a wish. The necessity of proletarian revolution is not a moral preference. It is the conclusion of a rigorous materialist analysis of how capitalism actually works, an analysis that has been proven correct time and time again in every country across every generation as a party statistical work on Britain, America, Japan, the Soviet Union, and now China has demonstrated the cold precision of numbers that do not lie. Our party has been through much, like our predecessors, the Bolsheviks who organized in illegal conditions, who were hunted, exiled, imprisoned, who maintained theoretical clarity through decades of defeat and isolation. We have persisted through the long night of counter-revolution. We have maintained the thread of Marxism without preservations, without falsifications, without the modernizations and revisions that hollowed out so much of what became before us. And that fidelity to the communist program is not stubbornness. It is the only thing that makes a revolutionary party worth anything at all. A party that abandons its principles when conditions get hard is not a revolutionary party. It is a pressure group waiting to be absorbed. We have refused absorption. We have refused every temptation to dress the program in fashionable clothes, to water it down, to make it palatable to those who would rather manage the system than destroy it. And because we have refused, we remain small, yes, but undefeated. And today we see on the horizon something we have not seen in a long time. We see the working class beginning to stir in China, in the United States, across Europe and the global South. We see our own ranks swelling, new sections forming, new militants joining our studies, attaching themselves to the class, forging themselves into communists through the discipline of theory and the fire of practice. The world communist movement is not dead. It is rebuilding, and we are part of that rebuilding because we are not a party that invented itself. We are a party that assigned itself to a world historical movement, one that began long before us and will continue long after us. A movement based on not national interest, not on racial solidarity, not on ambitions of great leaders, but in something far more powerful and far more durable, the material interests of the international working class in ending its own exploitation. The movement connects us backward through history to the Paris Commune, to the October Revolution, to Shanghai workers of 1927 who died fighting for a future that was stolen from them. And it connects us forward inevitably, not because we wish it, but because the laws of history demand it. To the Chinese proletariat that is right now being ground down in the factories and dormitories of the world's largest capital machine, we will link up with that proletariat not through charity or sentiment, but through the only bond that has ever meant anything in the history of the class struggle: shared interest, shared analysis, and shared organization against a common enemy. We close where, we close where we must always close, not with despair, not with false hope, but with clarity. China is not socialist. It never was. The CCP is not communist. It never was. The Chinese dream is the dream of a rising imperialist bourgeoisie funded by the exploitation of 900 million workers who cannot afford the railways they built. And the multipolarity that the left celebrates is nothing more than the prelude to a third world war that will ask those same workers to die for national interests of the class that exploits them. We refuse all of it. We refuse to choose between Washington or Beijing. We refuse to celebrate capitalist development with red flags on it. We stand where we have always stood, with the international working class, against all bourgeois forces, for the dictatorship of the proletariat on a world scale. That is our program. It has been proven correct by history. It will be proven correct again. And when the Chinese working class finally breaks through the surface, when the Foxconn revolts become something the riot police can no longer contain, we intend to be there, not as saviors, as comrades, because the world we will be fighting for is the same world we have always been fighting for. And that world is worth every sacrifice it demands of us.